Welcome back to Safety Third, where we continue our installation of our fully programmable ECU onto our BMW 635csi. The last episode we finished up with the hardware modifications needed to get the installation completed. This episode we're going to concentrate on getting this wiring sorted and installed. Let's get started. Here we are back in the engine bay. You'll see I've removed a few things just to make it a little easier for access to the wiring. I've removed the intake, of course, just to get access under here. I've removed the coil pack, again, just access and easier wiring. Let me walk you through the wiring itself. As you'll see here, you can see the two wiring bundles I have coming through the hole in the firewall by the glove box, the true firewall. So these are all the wires coming through from the ECU. I'm using 35 of the potential 48 different positions of the two different connectors. So I'm only using 35 out of 48. And it looks daunting and overwhelming, but really, if you think about it, 6 of these are going to go to the coil pack, 6 will go to the injectors, 6 will go to the wideband O2 sensor. So really, you're down to 17, and 4 of these are grounds. And so really, once you start whittling through these and getting these spliced into where they're going, shouldn't be too hard. So don't be overwhelmed.
Ooh, let me have some of that Cool Whip. What'd you say? You can't have a pie without Cool Whip. Cool Whip? Cool Whip, yeah. You mean Cool Whip? Yeah, Cool Whip. Cool Whip. Cool Whip. Cool Whip. Cool Whip. You're saying it weird. Why are you putting so much emphasis on the H? What are you talking about? I'm just saying it. Cool Whip. You put Cool Whip on pie. Pie tastes better with Cool Whip. Say whip. Whip. Now say Cool Whip. Cool Whip. Cool Whip. Cool Whip. Cool Whip. Cool Whip. You're eating hair!
Don't be overwhelmed. You see the coil pack bracket I've got taken off. I've made up a wiring harness for it, just put some sheathing and some cloth tape on it. But I took the original salvage yard connector, cut one of the coil connectors off, and I'm just using the front 3 or the first 3 positions on it. I lengthened it up and I put connector out here available for wiring into. These back 3 did the same thing, cut one of the connectors off, and these are the back 4. I'm sorry, the back 3. So I've got 3 and 3 on these 2 connectors. You'll see the variable reluctance wheel sensors I've got here. These actually, these are shielded, and these will give me my signal for the engine speed and top dead center of the crank. And as we go through the engine, you'll see the different wiring I've still got laid out. The fuel injector harness that I got from the salvage yard, I just basically plugged and played to use it on my my new injectors. But that's it right there. The 6 positions go to the ECU. 1 goes to the relay for power, and here's my idle air valve connectors for that. I think these are power and signal as well, power, ground, and signal. This is just goes to my intake air temperature sensor, which is on the bottom side of my intake. Throttle position sensor, same thing, power, ground, and signal. This is the cam angle sensor, which you can kind of see goes here, as well as the temperature sensors and switches as well. So this one goes to the gauge on the instrument cluster, this goes to the ECU, and this one here go to the auxiliary fan for the AC up front. And this is the additional injector, startup injector sensor, so that I'm not using that anymore. Okay, that's it. Let's go to the other side of the engine. Here we go on the other side. You'll see this bundle of wires was originally in the original harness. I just took them out because I'm going to be reusing these. These are all the sensors for intake temperature, like one over here, oil pressure, oil level, alternator voltage, stuff like that. I'll be using these. So I'll just integrate those into the wiring harness as well. Put the 2 relays here. This is where they originally were, so I'm just putting them back to where they were. These are all the outputs for the relays, as well as some of the inputs. So the signals that tell them to turn on. These will integrate into the ECU wiring harness as well. And that should be it. We'll get my power from here. This is the power to the battery. So this is all the power wiring that'll power all the injectors, coils, and the ECU. And the sensors here, and really that's about it. We've talked about everything over there. So we'll get started laying it out.
Okay, here we are underneath the dash. You'll see how I've mounted the ECU, the ECUmaster. I actually had some leftover 12 by 12 inch aluminum diamond plate I basically just cut some off to kind of fit behind the ECU between the dash rail here and the ECU. I just kind of bolted it up with the original bolts from the BMW ECU. Cut out a little bit and kind of made this brace across the ECU to hold it in there, but it fits really nice up in there. There's plenty of room for the, you'll see the harnesses that go through the firewall here, the hole in firewall, and the vacuum line for the mass air pressure sensor. But that's how I'm going to mount it. As soon as I get the glove box installed, you'll never be able to see it. But it fits really good. It's a little awkward, and I wanted to put it up here, but I wanted to have this back port available if I want to use the Bluetooth adapter or maybe some CAN stuff in the future. But that's why it's kind of this odd layout here, but I wanted to be able to have access to this. But that's it. We'll go back up top.
12 seconds later.
Alright, quick status report on where we're at. And I know what you're thinking. It's really not that bad. So before we get into wiring, let me just walk you through what I've done mechanically. I've actually changed a couple things around. One, for the exhaust shields, I actually took these off and put reflective heat shield on the bottom of them, just because I was kind of worried about this paint here sticking on there and flaking off in the long run. So anyway, underside is coated with adhesive reflective tape for heat shielding. For the sensor up front, I measured the distance between the head of the sensor and the toothed wheel on the cam, and it was about 3 millimeters separation, and I think the recommended settings is about 1 to 2 millimeters. So since this spacer here that they provide with the kit is Delrin, I just took this and took a flat piece of sandpaper and rubbed it on the sandpaper until I got about 1 millimeter spacing between the head of this sensor and the tooth wheel inside. Speaking of the tooth wheel, I actually had to advance it about 40 degrees or so. In reading the ECUmaster manual, it says that you have to actually have a signal from this cam sensor before it knows when to look or when to fire the number 1 cylinder. So I had it set at top dead center for number 1 before, and I think the way you have to have it is actually advanced, so it detects, the ECU detects number 1 first, and then it starts the firing sequence. Now it's all programmable within the ECU software. You can actually tell it which order to fire in and whatnot, so it's not a really big deal, but I went ahead and just advanced that wheel on the inside of the cam. Okay, as far as the wiring, you can see that I've installed the coil pack again with the wire loom for the 6 here, and I've got the 2 connectors back here, and then I've got all the wiring laid out. And reading the ECU manual again, apparently I only need 1 signal from the crank. If you come here and look at here's the actual, this is the flex plate from the manual transmission swap, but 1 sensor is a variable reluctance sensor that sits and counts the teeth, essentially the engine speed, and 1 told the ECU, the old ECU, where top dead center was with the crank. I don't need this anymore since I've got the cam angle sensor, so I only need 1 of the original variable reluctance sensors. So as such, I'm just going to use 1 of these, and I'll take 1 of these out of the wiring loom like I've got it laid out right now. Other than that, I just laid out some of the wiring and basically the locations it's going to go. Zip tied all the ones that I want together. You can see like the ones for the throttle position sensor, I've kind of zip tied to the ones from the harness itself. Same thing with the temperature sensors, the gauges here, idle air controller. You can see I've got them zip tied to the actual wires they're going to go to the ECU. So this is like the easiest way I could figure out to do it without soldering here or splicing all the wires here on the engine. So I'm just going to zip tie them together with some of these cheap zip ties and take it all out and put them all together later, splice them. I put the wideband O2 sensor on there. It's on the back of this back header here, or a back exhaust header. Fed it up through the back of the engine. I'll have it connected into here, these 4 from the ECU. And then I realized I didn't have a connector that goes into the O2, so I actually went and tried to find one online. This is actually from ECUmaster as well. Again, I'm not being sponsored by them, but it was $8. It was like the cheapest I could find. I looked at Summit, Amazon. The others are like 17, 18 bucks. So $8 at ECUmaster if you want a connector for your O2 sensor. It's got everything you need. So picked one of those up. Ran the wiring back, the ones that'll go back to the gauges and the relays on the other side, and I'll walk over there in a second, but everything's laid out. These 2 here I'll actually remove. I added these because I thought they were going to be for the crank angle sensor for these two. But because I'm reusing the old shielded cables, I'm just going to take these out when I remove the wiring loom to get it all wrapped up. Let's go to the other side. Okay, here we are on the other side. You'll see the ones that go to the connector, which is back down in here. That goes into all the gauges and the fuel pump and stuff like that. So the wiring from the ECU comes in here, and I've basically just took the wiring from the old loom and just laid them out where they should be. And I've marked the ones I want to go together. You can see like these two are together, and I'll just splice them together right there. This one is for the fuel pump. One comes from the relay, the fuel pump relay, and the other goes into the connector back here, which goes back to the fuel pump. So I'll just put these two together and that sort of thing. These four are also from the original connector, from the original harness. These are all going to go underneath the engine here. So one's the starter, one's the alternator gauge for voltage, and two go to the level sensor that's in the bottom of the oil pan. So these kind of get fed together underneath there. And here's the power for the ECU that I'm going to get into here. This turns on the main relay. This one turns on the fuel pump relay. So I've got everything laid out where I want it. Zip tied together about where I need it. All of these are the outputs from the main relay. These are from the original wiring harness. I'm just going to reuse them. So this thick one goes to the injectors. This one will go to the O2 sensor to power it. And these two, since I've got additional two wires, I'll just put one to each of the coil pack connectors, since I've got two and the extra wire. So I'll lay this in the wiring loom and get all that laid out together. But that's it. I know it looks like a mess, but it's really straightforward, especially if you just take notes about the original ECU from the E24, as well as the connectors for the ECUmaster. Got the black connector, there's a gray connector, just what they are, the colors, as well as how to wire up the coils, the injectors 1 through 6, throttle body, just stuff you'll need to know when you're putting this together, like what pin the tack is, stuff like that. So it's pretty straightforward. Just kind of keep it straight in your head, write it down, and put it all together one by one. Eventually you get through it and get done. So next up, one more thing I want to mention about some of the wiring. As you start putting this together, you'll realize that there's more connections than you have wires in the coming from the ECU. Like for instance, one of the wires from the ECU is for TPS. Well, obviously you've got 3 wires for the TPS, throttle position sensor. You also have 3 wires for this as well, but only one going back to the ECU. So you want to keep in mind which sensors are powered and which are just essentially passive. Like for instance, the temperature sensor. This is a passive sensor. It just changes resistance. So one of these is going to go to your sensor ground, which is this one here coming from the ECU, and the other is going to go to the output. I'm sorry, to the input for the ECU for the coolant temperature. So it's the same thing here. One of these is going to go to like this one's powered and this is powered. So you got to get 5 volts. This is the 5 volts from the output of the ECU, and this is the ground for the sensors. So all your sensors share the same ground because they want to minimize noise. If you're sharing the same ground with all the other mechanical bits like the coil and injectors, those have a lot of noise to them. So, excuse me, all your sensors are going to have their own ground, and they're all going to get, or the ones that are active actually get the 5 volt from the ECU. So this 5 volt and this ground will power this and this, since these are both active, and the third wire in these goes to the ECU as a signal. So this yellow one goes to the signal for the throttle position sensor. This, I think it's a yellow one on here as well, goes to the ECU for cam angle sensor. So keep that in mind. Keep your sensor grounds separate, and your chassis grounds, which are what all of these are. These are all on the ECU as big power grounds and chassis grounds for your coils and your injectors. This gets a lug on it and will go somewhere on the block somewhere, just screwed in the block somewhere as a ground. But keep your sensors separate, and just keep in mind which ones are active and which ones are passive, and where your grounds need to go and whatnot. So keep that in mind when you're powering up your sensors.
2,000 years later.
Okay, so the wiring harness is complete. The original BMW wiring harness is integrated into the new ECUmaster wiring harness. put everything together. I wanted to walk you guys through what I did. First of all, I did solder these together, all these wires together, and I know the internet is going to yell at me for soldering automotive wiring, but I feel that this soldering is much stronger than crimps. And people will say there's a reason why you don't see soldering on new cars. It's because it's stronger. I don't believe that. I think the soldering that I've done here is much stronger than the crimping I could have done. The reason why you don't see soldering on new cars is, one, new cars shouldn't be splicing two wires together, and two, anybody that's done soldering before will know how labor intensive it is. So I don't buy the argument that you don't see it on new cars because it's not as strong. So I went ahead and soldered everything together, protected everything. It's nice and strong. All the connections are nice and strong. So I feel this is a much better solution than crimping. So with that, after you put together your harness, obviously, please go through it and pin it out. Make sure that the signal you want from your connector goes to the location you want. When I was doing that, for me, I actually found I had two ground wires switched. The coils have a chassis ground and a sensor ground that goes to the ECU, so I had those both switched up. So had I not done that, I wouldn't have found out. I may have fried mine. Well, probably wouldn't have fried it, but may have not have caught the issue when I was trying to start up the engine. So please check it with a multimeter when you finally put it together. Wanted to walk through the different locations. So obviously this is the original connector that comes from the ECU, from the BMW over by the fuse box. My two original relays, the main relay and the fuel relay. I just sent the signals in there from the ECU to turn it on. These are my power connections to my battery. These are the wires that go out onto the alternator and starter and whatnot. I ended up reusing the variable reluctance shielded cable. I couldn't find one that I was happy with, and this one fit and was working, so I went ahead and just reused it. However, I went ahead and for the shielding, you're supposed to ground the shield for the cable, and I just added this lug to it, and I'll shield it underneath the dash. Instead of running the ground cable back up through here, back into the chassis ground, which I'm going to use on the block. So I felt it would probably just pick up additional noise if it went back through the engine, so I'm going to go ahead and ground it underneath the dash. Other than that, everything's together. We've got all the connectors for the temperature, fuel injectors, cam angle sensor, throttle position sensor, intake air temp, O2, the ground. You'll see I've got a lot of grounds here. I probably overdid it with the amount of grounds and the heaviness of my gauge, but I was reading the ECUmaster manual, and they recommended certain size grounds for coils. Now, they were probably talking about passive coils, which pull a lot more current than these active coils, if you will. So I probably overdid it with grounds, but overkill is all right. I didn't want to go too small, then end up melting the wires with too much current. But that's it. Everything's together. Let's go ahead and put it in the car. Wiring loom is in. Everything's wrapped. Looks good. You can actually see it coming through the firewall here, the back of the glove box, through the main firewall. Everything's wrapped in this braided wrap with some cloth tape. Looks really good. All the connectors are on. You can actually see the loom going back over here, back behind the fuse box. Goes around to the front, and there's the two relays for the main and the fuel pump as well as a connector at the bottom of the fuse box that goes back to the dash. But everything's on, everything's connected except for the spark plug leads and the spark plugs, because I need to do some cranking to get the signals from the cam angle sensor as well as the engine speed sensor. Part of the setup for the software is to do some cranking to make sure you're getting the right signals and getting the right offset. So haven't powered anything up yet. In fact, the ground for the negative terminal on the battery hasn't been hooked up yet. But I'll get everything set up. I'll hook up to the ECU and start going through the setup. You'll need for the next step, you'll need a timing light for the front of the engine, just to figure out where the software thinks top dead center is, and then you have to do the offset depending on where your top dead on your crank is. So we'll move on to the next step.
And this is a look of the final installation underneath the dash by the glove box. You can see I actually put the zip tied the Bluetooth connector here. See all the connectors come through here. Here's my vacuum line to my manifold, and these are the two extra wires that go to the tach and the fuel gauge, or the fuel economy gauge. That's it. Everything's connected, ready to go. I'll power it up and see where we are.
A few inches later.
Okay, wiring harness is complete, installed. Next step in the process is to obviously download the software and check all your outputs and inputs to make sure everything's wired correctly. The ECUmaster software, you can actually download that from their website. You don't need to buy their ECU. You can download it and actually play with the system and kind of build your own base maps for your system if you just want to see what's available and all the parameters and functionality that's available with the system. For me, the first things I did was actually went through the system, checked my inputs and outputs, checked to make sure the fuel injectors were clicking, cranked the engine, make sure all the coils were firing, got my timing light out there, made sure all the sparks were going on. The sensors are all working, triggers are working. The only thing I couldn't get to work initially were my relays, both my main relay and my fuel pump relay. The way I wired it, I initially thought that the ECU was putting out 12 volts to turn them both on. It's not. It's actually pull to ground output, so I actually had to change the wiring on those two relays just to have the output from here be a pull to ground to turn on both the relays. But after that, everything's working fine. Like I said, all the sensors are working, triggers are working. So the next step in the process, after you make sure everything's wired up correctly and actually functioning properly, there's actually a tool in here that you can use to actually turn on your outputs and make sure they're actually working as they should. So you don't actually need to go out there and crank the engine explicitly to get it to work. So there's some cool tools in here that you can use. But once you get verify all the sensors are working correctly, next thing is actually make sure the triggers are triggering like they should. For me, the engine speed trigger on the bell housing for the crank was working fine. My Hall sensor for the cam sensor wasn't working correctly. I actually didn't have it turned on. There's a pull-up resistor checkbox that you put on for all Hall and optical type sensors. I didn't have that checked, so I checked that and it was working fine now. So if you go through, let me show you some of these maps here. But anyway, there's different gauges, there's logs that you can do. This is cranking and running here that you can kind of go through and check all the air to fuel ratios you pulse width for your injectors and whatnot. There's also a scope function, and this is the scope function for the primary trigger, which is the engine speed one, and the secondary trigger, which is my cam angle sensor. Those are actually triggering just fine. And after that, the next thing you need to do is go through your ignition offset, which is essentially crank the engine and see where your number one injector is firing, or number one coil is firing, with respect to the top dead center on your crank. You actually need an adjustable timing gun to be able to do that. Mine is, and you just kind of adjust it until you see what the angle is, and put that angle in your setup software to get your ignition set up correctly. And then once you have that running set correctly, the next thing to do is actually crank it over and go through the ignition sequence to, let me pull it up here, ignition outputs, to verify that your sequence of firing the injectors is proper. So yes, the firing sequence for this engine is 153624, but if the cam sensor isn't aligned with that number one first firing sequence, you actually need to offset it by 1 cylinder, 2 cylinders, whatever it is. For me, I was actually off by 5 cylinders. So basically there's an output offset for your ignition outputs. You just go through that, and it's initially set to 0, which is your standard firing order, 153624 for this engine. And then you crank the engine. If it doesn't start, go to the next sequence, offset that sequence by 1, try to start it again. Anyway, mine was off by 5 essentially, so it really doesn't matter where that cam angle sensor is, how you set it up on your engine, because you can offset your ignition like this. So anyway, mine was off by 5, set it up, and it's cranking and actually starting up okay. So let's just show you. Doesn't sound very good. The timing is all off. not tuned for anything. The injectors really aren't set right, but it is running. So everything's set up right. My scope. Here we are. The engine running now. You can actually check anything in this scope with the scrap log function. Check your air-to-fuel ratio, pulse width for your injectors, timing, everything like that. So here's the point I'm at. I'm good to stop here. Everything's wired correctly. Everything's running. And we'll go ahead and stop the video for today. Well, that's it for this episode. The wiring is complete. Everything's functioning like it should. The car starts. It runs really rough. But join me next time where we actually put it on a dyno, tune it professionally, and actually see how much horsepower we can get out of this thing. Until next time.